So why would school districts want to implement an MTSS, or why are we finding that school districts are implementing an MTSS? It's because we want to improve the outcomes for all students from the academic, behavioral, and social emotional lens. So looking at students not just from their academic needs, but also thinking about the different behaviors and different skills that they need to develop in order to become a productive member of society. We want to make sure that we're addressing the unmet needs of so many students and subgroups. We also think that the idea of de-siloing the number of different practices that we're implementing, and sometimes we had different buckets of people who would be providing services and providing education opportunities to our subgroup students. At times, we were finding that it's not as successful as what we can do with MTSS, which really helps us to take apart having different groups of people work with different students. And it helps us make our systems and processes more effective and connected within our school district. So we start to see that schools are starting to look at all of the different meetings that they're having and trying to come up with a more streamlined approach to ensuring that we're meeting the needs of all students and that we have like an aligned vision in schools, which is, I think, a really cool thing and an outcome of MTSS. We want to move our students along, no matter where they are, if they're at, above, or below our expectations. So we want to help to make sure that all students are growing and that we're meeting them where they are in order for them to be successful. And we also are finding that people are really wanting to take a whole child approach to supporting students. And when we think about whole child, I'll get into this a little bit later, but whole child means that we're looking at students not just from that academic kind of perspective, but we're taking a look at their needs from the home environment to how they're conducting themselves within the community, those social skills that they need in order to be successful in the community, in the classroom, and in the future when they're an adult, so that we're making sure that when a student leaves us, that they have the variety of skills that they need in order to become, like I said, that successful member of society. We also find that there's a high number of implications that have been founded in policy, and specifically in ESSA, which I'll talk about right now. So we're seeing that MTSS is becoming more widespread because of educational policy that has passed over the years. And there have been two main buckets really that have kind of caused this to kind of ramp up in terms of the need. So back in the 70s, we had the introduction of IDEA and the need for us to provide special education services to our students. In 1997, that was reauthorized, and at that point, they incorporated the idea of encouraging folks to start thinking about providing positive behavioral interventions and supports. So the idea of PBIS was introduced in 1997, and that implied that there was funding that was directed towards special education specifically. And in 2001, we had the introduction of NCLB. And at this point, we really saw a ramp up in terms of putting a focus on reading and math proficiency for all students, and that all students needed to be assessed. This really was the impetus for the beginning of some key data analysis that we have been really starting to do more of in schools. And with that, we would start to look at not only looking at, the core average student and how they were responding and making sure that they were proficient, but really looking at the different subgroups of students within our schools. So with that, we started to notice that sometimes we were over-identifying students for special education, or that the students in special education weren't making as much progress as those students who weren't found to be in special education. So in 2004, with the reauthorization of IDEA there, the idea of response to intervention was incorporated. With that, there was additional funding in order to help schools provide supplemental programs and special education funds into general education. So at this point, we started to see the idea that early intervening services was important and that more focus needed to be put toward prevention as opposed to later response or later intervening services. And typically we would find that students would become eligible for special education around 4th grade, and we were finding that that was too late for students to actually make the progress that they needed. So the idea here is that that IDEA kind of spearheaded this idea of looking at how students were responding to interventions and ensuring that we were putting supports into place for those students. So for 11 years, that was the idea. I know a lot of schools started to even incorporate RTI into the identification of students with learning disabilities specifically. So that's kind of across the nation, we've seen a big difference in terms of how states have taken the 2004 reauthorization and incorporated that. So in 2015, we had the ESSA, which actually turned then into Every Student Succeeds Act, and the main thing that we're seeing here is that the focus has shifted to all students and making sure that every student is really successful because of what we were seeing for the years previous. And the big thing here is that we're finding that schools are choosing to implement MTSS, that even though it's not regulated or a federal mandate that students or that schools must implement an MTSS, schools are choosing it because it helps really to take a look at the different recommendations and the different policies that states are putting forth, and it puts it into a framework that is actually successful. So we're going to get into how that looks in schools. The interesting thing I think that we have to think about, and kind of a paradigm shift that helps us to think about and kind of ground ourselves in what MTSS does that's different than maybe in the past, is that we used to look at trying to help fix kids or help provide supports to those kids. But we as school practitioners have never improved. We've not gotten better by fixing kids. Kids come into us with what they have, and they don't need to be fixed. Kids do the best that they can with what they have, and we as school practitioners need to ensure that we're providing those supports to those students by being able to support the adults in changing the way that we work with students, which I think is maybe a different approach or a different way of thinking about what we're doing. So with RTI in the past, it was the student has a need. I need to identify that they have a need so that we can get, a special education teacher to work with them, as opposed to now thinking about what supports do we have available in our school to help support all of our students in a real systematic approach.